For decades, the world has seen India through the lens of democracy, population, and Bollywood. But now, Israel, one of the sharpest intelligence powers on earth, is revealing something the world wasn't prepared to hear. Behind the calm diplomacy and spiritual imagery lies a rising superpower, strategic, self-reliant, and quietly rewriting the rules of global power. The shocking truth: India isn't just another partner in the New World Order, it might soon define it. For years, the relationship between Israel and India existed in the shadows. Two nations bound by different histories, yet shaped by similar realities, surrounded by adversaries, tested by war, and forced to innovate to survive. But today, that relationship has come into the open, not just as an alliance of convenience, but as a revelation of mutual respect and admiration. Israeli analysts, military, intelligence, and economic are beginning to speak openly about India in ways the West has not yet fully understood. They see a nation that has mastered restraint as a form of power. A country that, unlike others, does not flaunt its might, but builds it brick by brick, year after year, without apology. The Israelis, perhaps more than anyone, understand what it means to be surrounded and yet unbroken. They recognize in India a similar DNA, a civilization that has endured invasions, colonialism, and division, yet refuses to collapse. One Israeli defense expert recently said, "India is not a country that needs saving, it is a country preparing to lead." That observation may sound simple, but it carries profound implications. Because for years, the West has spoken of India as a potential, the next big thing, the rising giant, the world's back office. But Israel sees something different. It sees a nation of 1.4 billion people, but is not merely catching up, but leapfrogging in critical areas: defense, technology, energy, and intelligence. Let's look at the military partnership first. Israel's defense industry, among the most advanced in the world, has found not just a client in India, but a collaborator. Together, they are developing systems that combine Israeli precision with Indian scale: drones, radar networks, missile defense systems. This is not a transactional exchange, it's strategic synergy. And what's most revealing is how Israeli experts now describe India as a reliable power, a phrase rarely used in geopolitics today. For Israel, reliability matters more than rhetoric. It has seen allies come and go, promises made and broken. But India's quiet, steady hand, its refusal to jump into wars or take reckless positions, commands respect. When the West panics, India observes. When others posture, India plans. And this approach, Israel believes, is what separates a temporary power from a lasting one. Then there is intelligence cooperation, a domain that rarely makes headlines but shapes the future of global security. Israeli intelligence agencies, known for their surgical efficiency, have increasingly turned to Indian counterparts for insights on regions Israel cannot easily access: South Asia, the Indian Ocean, even the vast and complex networks stretching into Africa. This cooperation is not charity, it's mutual necessity. Both nations understand the world's new threats: cyber warfare, terrorism, disinformation, and both know that survival now depends on information, not ideology. But perhaps the most shocking truth, as some Israeli analysts put it, is that India's rise has not followed the Western script. There was no Marshall Plan, no imported democracy, no foreign tutelage. India has done it the hard way, through trial, error, and endurance. And that is what Israel admires most. Because in a world where most nations depend on others for validation, India has built its own path, defined its own story, and stayed true to its civilization's core balance. You see, Israel understands something the rest of the world often misses: that India's greatest strength is not its size, but its civilization's patience, a patience born of thousands of years of continuity, a confidence that does not need to announce itself, but acts when necessary and retreats when wise. When Israeli thinkers look at India today, they see a paradox that works: a nation both ancient and modern, spiritual yet strategic, democratic yet deeply nationalistic. And they know this combination is rare, perhaps the rarest form of power in the 21st century. Economically, too, Israel sees what's coming. India's digital economy is expanding faster than any major nation's. Its space program, once mocked, is now landing on the moon's far side. Its manufacturing is scaling up, not as an imitation of China, but as an alternative to it. And Israeli investors, long cautious, are now pouring funds into Indian startups, defense tech, and AI ventures. They call it the decade of Indian precision, a quiet recognition that this is not just growth, it's transformation. There's another layer here, one of shared psychological understanding. Both Israel and India know what it means to be misunderstood. Both have faced global criticism for defending themselves, and both have realized that moral lectures rarely stop missiles. This mutual understanding has built trust not found in treaties or press releases, but in real, lived experience. So when Israeli officials call India a pillar of stability in a collapsing global order, they're not flattering, they're diagnosing. The world today is fragmented. Old alliances are fading, new rivalries emerging. Amid this chaos, India's steady hand offers something every nation craves: predictability. And perhaps that's the shocking truth the world must finally confront, that India, long viewed as a follower in the global game, is now emerging as the quiet architect of a new order, one built not on dominance, but on discipline, not on ideology, but identity. For Israel, a nation that has survived by seeing clearly when others were blind, this truth about India is not surprising, it's inevitable. Because beneath the noise of geopolitics, what defines a true power is not its capacity to destroy, but its ability to endure, adapt, and inspire. India, in Israel's eyes, has become precisely that: a power that cannot be crushed, because its strength does not come from its weapons, but from its will. And in a century where every empire rises and falls faster than the last, that kind of power might just be the rarest and most enduring of them all. Israel's perception of India has undergone a profound transformation in recent years. For decades, the relationship between the two nations existed quietly, shrouded in the language of diplomacy and necessity. But as the global order shifts and power redistributes, Israel has begun to articulate what it truly sees in India, not just a partner, but a reflection of its own journey. When Israeli analysts, defense experts, and strategists look at India today, they do not see a developing nation chasing superpowers. They see a civilization mastering the art of endurance. They recognize a nation that, like themselves, has been forged in adversity and shaped by necessity rather than luxury. To Israel, India's story resonates deeply. Both countries were born from struggle, surrounded by skepticism, and forced to build modern nations in hostile environments. Both faced existential threats early in their histories, and both chose innovation over intimidation as the path to survival. In Israel's case, a small landmass surrounded by adversaries learned to survive by turning intelligence into its greatest weapon. In India's case, a vast and diverse democracy surrounded by volatility learned to channel patience into power. Israel admires India not for its rhetoric or its politics, but for its ability to endure, to absorb pressure, navigate chaos, and still emerge stable. That, for Israel, is the true mark of a resilient nation. Israeli experts have long believed that true power is revealed not in how a nation acts in moments of strength, but in how it behaves under constraint. And by that measure, India's conduct in the 21st century has fascinated them. While others rush to assert dominance, India has mastered restraint. While others depend on alliances for validation, India remains grounded in autonomy. This self-reliance, this refusal to be dictated by global pressure, is something Israel understands intimately. It is the quiet assertion of nations that have been underestimated for too long. Israel has observed that India's rise has followed no familiar pattern. It is not built on conquest or colonization, nor on imported blueprints from Western institutions. Instead, it has evolved organically, rooted in its own civilization and guided by an internal compass that prizes balance over bravado. Israeli thinkers often describe this as the civilizational logic of India, an instinct to absorb, adapt, and advance without losing identity. They find this remarkable because it mirrors Israel's own approach to modernize without erasing tradition, to innovate without abandoning heritage. Both nations understand that power derived from identity is far more sustainable than power borrowed from ideology. In military and intelligence circles, Israeli officers frequently remark that India's strength is misunderstood by the West. The West tends to measure power in terms of GDP, defense spending, or global influence. Israel measures it differently in survival capacity, strategic depth, and national will. India's ability to maintain internal cohesion despite linguistic, religious, and regional diversity is, to Israeli eyes, an extraordinary feat. They see a nation that, despite every challenge, holds together not by force, but by faith in its own pluralism. This, to Israeli strategists, is a more advanced form of statcraft than any military arsenal. When Israeli defense firms collaborate with Indian counterparts, they notice something that goes beyond technology. They see a mindset, a determination to learn, improve, and adapt quickly. In the field of defense, India's approach has moved from buyer to builder. Israeli engineers speak with admiration about how Indian teams absorb advanced systems, dissect them, and then localize them to suit domestic needs. They say this ability reflects a larger national characteristic, a drive towards self-sufficiency. Israel recognizes in this the same instinct that defines its own military-industrial complex, to never depend fully on others for security. Beyond defense, Israel's intelligence community holds India in quiet respect. The cooperation between the two nations in intelligence sharing is rarely publicized, but deeply valued. Israeli officers often note that Indian intelligence agencies possess an analytical patience rare in the modern era. Instead of reacting impulsively to every threat, India observes, compiles, and calculates. This long-term strategic thinking mirrors Israel's own doctrine of security, one that prioritizes foresight over force. Both nations understand that the battlefield of the 21st century is not only physical but informational, and that the power to predict is often greater than the power to attack. Israeli scholars studying India's political evolution are equally struck by how a country of such immense diversity has maintained democratic continuity without fracture. They see this as an extraordinary act of political intelligence. Israel, too, is a democracy under constant pressure, balancing ideology, religion, and national security. In India, they recognize a much larger version of that same delicate balance. For Israeli observers, This ability to sustain democracy amid turbulence is not a sign of fragility, but of extraordinary strength. It signals a society that has learned to convert disorder into order through sheer civilizational wisdom. Culturally, Israeli thinkers are drawn to India's philosophical depth. They often point out that India's capacity for tolerance, its comfort with contradiction, and its acceptance of complexity give it a unique advantage in the modern world. In a global landscape increasingly defined by extremes, India's moderation stands out. It is not weakness, as some might claim, but a form of intelligence, the wisdom to act without overreacting. Israel understands this deeply. Its own history has taught it that enduring power is not about dominance, but about maintaining equilibrium amid chaos. The admiration is not one-sided. Israel's reflection on India is in many ways a projection of its own ideals. Both nations believe in the primacy of education, the sanctity of national security, and the transformative power of technology. Both have turned necessity into innovation, Israel in agriculture and defense, India in software and space. When Israeli commentators discuss India's achievements in digital governance, renewable energy, or indigenous defense systems, they see not an emerging economy, but a strategic peer. And that realization is reshaping the way Israel views its place in Asia. Economically, Israeli investors are increasingly looking toward India as the future of sustainable growth. They are drawn not only by the numbers, the population, the market, the youth, but by the attitude. India's economic rise, they note, is being built on discipline rather than debt, on innovation rather than imitation. Israeli analysts describe this as the slow strength model, one that prioritizes long-term stability over short-term spectacle. It is the same model Israel itself has followed, building a resilient economy in a volatile region through persistence and planning. At the diplomatic level, Israeli officials have noticed India's ability to maintain friendships across rival blocs. India buys weapons from Russia, trades with the West, partners with Israel, and still maintains influence in the global South. For Israel, this kind of strategic autonomy is enviable. They call it the art of many doors. The capacity to enter multiple arenas without being trapped in any single one. In a world where most nations are forced to choose sides, India's balanced diplomacy appears to Israel as a rare demonstration of strategic intelligence. When Israeli strategists analyze India's global posture, they often highlight one trait: composure. In moments of global crisis, India remains measured. Whether it is war in its neighborhood, shifts in global alliances, or pressure from superpowers, India rarely reacts with panic. This composure, Israelis believe, comes from an ancient civilizational perspective, a sense that time itself is a tool of power. Israel, too, has built its security on the understanding that survival requires patience as much as strength. Both nations know that the one who endures longest eventually prevails. There is, in Israeli circles, a growing recognition that India's rise marks a new phase in global geopolitics, one in which wisdom and restraint may prove more valuable than size or speed. Israel sees in India not just a rising power, but a stabilizing force, a nation that holds fast when others fracture, a partner that understands the price of peace and the weight of responsibility. Israeli observers often say that in a century of uncertainty, India represents continuity, not just political or economic continuity, but civilizational continuity. And for a nation like Israel, which has fought to preserve its identity against overwhelming odds, that continuity is the ultimate form of strength. The parallels between the two nations are not accidental, they are the outcome of shared values and similar histories. Both emerged from struggle, both built themselves in defiance of the odds, and both learned that intelligence of mind, of strategy, of timing is the ultimate weapon. When Israelis reveal their perspective on India, they do so not as outsiders looking in, but as kindred spirits recognizing themselves in another. To them, India's rise is not surprising, it is familiar. It is the rise of a nation that has learned the hardest truth of all, that power sustained by wisdom outlasts power built on force. When Israeli analysts speak of India's power, they often do so in a tone of admiration that surprises even their Western counterparts. They call it the power of patience, a form of strength that rarely announces itself, yet endures longer than any show of force. Israel, a nation that has survived through clarity of vision and sharpness of instinct, recognizes in India a very different but equally formidable kind of resilience. To Israeli thinkers, the shocking truth about India is that its greatest weapon is not military might or economic mass, but civilizational patience, the quiet ability to endure storms without losing direction. In an age where nations seek to dominate through speed and spectacle, India's stillness is its strategy. This patience is not born of passivity. It is not the silence of weakness, but the calm of calculation. When Israeli observers watch how India handles crisis, whether regional conflicts, diplomatic pressures, or internal challenges, they see a country that chooses timing over temper. Israel, too, has learned that timing is the hidden architecture of survival. Both nations operate in regions of relentless volatility, surrounded by rival powers and ideological hostilities. But where Israel responds with surgical precision, India responds with civilizational scale. The rhythm may differ, but the instinct is the same, to act only when action has meaning. Israeli strategists describe India as a nation that measures power across centuries, not election cycles. It is a rare perspective in today's world, where most countries chase immediate validation and short-term gains. India's patience, they say, comes from its civilizational continuity, an inheritance of thousands of years of philosophical depth. In this continuity lies confidence, the confidence to wait, to observe, to adapt. For Israel, this is an unfamiliar yet fascinating concept, because its own history has been one of compressed time, of survival in decades, not millennia. But precisely because of that, Israelis admire India's long horizon. They see in it a model of how a civilization sustains itself by refusing to be consumed by the urgency of the moment. In Israeli intelligence and defense discussions, there is often reference to India's ability to absorb shocks without losing stability. This capacity, they argue, comes not from institutions alone, but from the mindset of endurance embedded in the culture itself. India's diversity, its multiplicity of languages, religions, and identities, should by all logic make it fragile, yet it remains whole. Israeli scholars point out that this resilience cannot be explained through Western political theory. It must be understood as a spiritual and civilizational phenomenon. The same India that can sustain protest and disagreement within its democracy is the India that can absorb external pressure without implosion. For Israel, this represents the ultimate strategic strength, the ability to remain cohesive while appearing chaotic. There is a deeper psychological understanding here. Israel has long known that in geopolitics, a perception can be as powerful as policy. Nations that appear volatile are often underestimated. India's apparent slowness, its deliberative diplomacy, its avoidance of loud confrontation, these Israelis believe are often misread by outsiders as hesitation. In reality, they are forms of control. To hold one's position in a world of shifting alliances is not to stand still but to stand firm. Israeli experts often remark that India's greatest victories are invisible crises avoided, conflicts de-escalated, pressures absorbed. Such victories do not make headlines, but they make history. Israeli military thinkers find this patience particularly relevant to strategy. In modern warfare, where precision and restraint matter as much as aggression, the ability to wait for the right moment can decide outcomes. India's approach to its borders, for instance, is marked by caution that conceals capability. Israeli analysts who have studied India's defense doctrine see a pattern of deterrence that mirrors Israel's own logic: reveal just enough to signal strength, conceal enough to maintain unpredictability. The restraint itself becomes a weapon, a form of psychological control over adversaries. This, Israelis say, is power of a higher order, power rooted in wisdom, not impulse. Economically too, Israel finds India's patience instructive. The world often praises India's rapid growth, but rarely appreciates the discipline behind it. Unlike other rising economies that expand through debt-driven booms, India builds slowly but steadily. Israeli economists note that this patience allows India to correct its own mistakes without collapse. They point to India's technology revolution, which did not erupt overnight, but matured over decades. This gradualism, they argue, is what ensures durability. Israel, a nation of rapid innovation, finds in India a complement, a civilization of sustained creation. When speed meets stability, something enduring emerges. Culturally, Israelis sense that India's patience comes from its spiritual worldview. The Indian idea of time is not linear, but cyclical. Empires rise and fall, but the civilization remains. This worldview gives India a kind of immunity to despair. It allows the nation to absorb setbacks without losing confidence. Israel, whose own story is one of exile and return, understands this instinct. It knows that survival depends on faith, not just in God, but in time. Indian patience, then, is not merely strategic, it is existential. It is the collective memory of a people who have seen conquerors come and go, ideologies rise and fade, yet have remained rooted in their essence. In Israeli universities and think tanks, there is growing discussion about India's role in the new multipolar world. They argue that while other powers seek dominance through coercion, India seeks influence through consistency. This consistency is itself an extension of patience. The refusal to be swayed by temporary alignments or ideological trends. India's foreign policy, they note, is not built on fear or dependence, but on balance. It engages with Washington without alienating Moscow, partners with Israel without offending the Arab world, and invests in Africa and Asia without lecturing them. To Israeli analysts, this ability to maintain equilibrium in an unstable world is a sign of mastery. Only nations with deep civilizational patience can afford to be neutral in a time of extremes. Israel also recognizes that patience, in India's case, is a form of soft power. The world is increasingly drawn to India, not because it imposes its will, but because it radiates composure. From its yoga philosophy to its digital diplomacy, India projects calm confidence. Israeli observers find this compelling because it contrasts sharply with the noise of global politics. They see that India's quiet influence, its ability to attract without demanding, to inspire without imposing, represents a new model of leadership. In a century exhausted by confrontation, patience itself becomes persuasive. In security cooperation, Israeli officials privately note that India's methodical approach to building partnerships is part of this same civilizational patience. Deals take time, but once made, they last. Israel, accustomed to rapid, transactional diplomacy, finds this stability refreshing. Indian decision makers may move slowly, but they move with purpose. Once trust is established, it is rarely broken. This long view approach, Israelis say, is what makes India a dependable ally. In a world where alliances shift with elections, India's constancy is strategic gold. Israeli strategists studying the Indo-Pacific often argue that India's greatest geopolitical advantage is time. While other powers race to dominate, India is willing to wait for the tides of opportunity to turn in its favor. This approach confuses those who measure success by quarterly outcomes, but it makes perfect sense to those who measure in decades. Israel, though smaller in scale, has practiced a similar patience in its regional dealings, knowing when to engage, when to deter, and when to simply endure. The similarity of mindset has become the foundation of mutual respect between the two nations. There is also an emotional understanding between Israel and India that goes beyond strategy. Both nations carry the memory of struggle, the knowledge of vulnerability, and the conviction that endurance is strength. Israelis often speak of chutzpah, the audacity to survive and succeed against odds. Indians, in their own way, express the same through darya, patience rooted in faith. Both are responses to adversity, shaped by different cultures, but born of the same truth. Survival is an act of intelligence, not luck. In Israeli commentary, India's patience is now being described as the new currency of power. In a world addicted to speed, the nation that can slow down and think clearly holds the advantage. India's refusal to be provoked, its resistance to pressure, and its calm assertion of national interest are beginning to influence how other powers behave around it. Israel understands that patience, when combined with purpose, becomes deterrence. The nation that does not react impulsively cannot be manipulated easily. When Israeli defense leaders visit New Delhi, they often remark on the paradox. They observe a nation with immense military capacity that prefers peace, a country capable of retaliation that prefers restraint. To them, this restraint is not weakness, but supreme control. It is the discipline of a civilization that has learned the cost of anger and the value of waiting. They see in India what they wish more nations understood, that real strength is the ability to choose not to use it. Israeli philosophers and policymakers alike view India as an example of how patience can coexist with progress. Despite criticism, despite pressure, despite being constantly compared to faster moving economies, India moves at its own rhythm. Israelis call this the rhythm of confidence, the pace of a nation that knows it will arrive because it always has. For a country like Israel, constantly forced to act within compressed time frames, there is something deeply inspiring in that kind of endurance. It is a reminder that there are different ways to be powerful, and that perhaps the oldest way, the way of patience, may yet prove the most enduring.